In North London, the wood green shopping city dominates the skyline. It's a massive brutalist structure built of concrete and glass, a hub of commerce. Every day, thousands of people stream through its doors. They buy food, they buy clothes, they meet friends. It's a place of constant motion, a place where the noise of living never really stops. Directly above the shopping center, sitting on top of little roofs like a fortress, is a housing complex. It is known as Sky City. The flats are accessed by walkways that look down upon the busy streets below. To live there is to be suspended above the crowd. You are the part of the city, yet physically separated from it. In these flats, people live in high density. They share walls, they share trash chutes, they share the same air. In early 2006, the world was moving fast. The internet was reshaping communication. London was booming. But in one specific flat, in Wood Green, a bedsit owned by Metropolitan Housing Trust, time had ceased to move. Behind a blue door, the air was still. The heating was humming, and a television was flickering, casting a blue light over a room that no one had entered for 2 years. This is the story of Joyce Carol Vincent. It's not a ghost story, it's a story about the architecture of our modern lives. It's a story about how a woman, surrounded by millions of people, can simply cease to be, and how the world can take 26 months to notice she's gone. To understand the tragedy, we must look at the life that preceded it. The silence of the end stands in stark contrast to the vibrancy of the beginning. Joyce Vincent was born in Hammersmith in October 1965. Her parents were from Grenada. She was the youngest of five sisters. By the time she reached adulthood in the 1980s, Joyce was not a woman on the margins. She was at the center of things. She was striking, she was charismatic. Friends from the time remember her as impeccable. She was the kind of woman who turned heads when she entered a room. She was ambitious. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Joyce worked for Ernst& Young, one of the largest and most prestigious accounting firms in the world. She worked in the Treasury Department in the City of London. This was a time of excess, of high finance, and Joyce was a part of it. She earned a good salary, she drove a car, she had a wide circle of friends. She was not isolated. She moved in circles that included musicians and artists. She met Nelson Mandela during a visit to London. She dined with famous singers. She had a singing voice of her own, one that she reportedly dreamed of using professionally. Those who knew her then describe a woman full of life. A woman who was upwardly mobile, well spoken, and deeply connected. She was engaged to be married at one point. She had plans. But the facade of successful life can be brittle. We often assume that people with good jobs and bright smiles are safe. We assume they have safety nets, but safety nets are woven from relationships, and relationships can fray. The unraveling of Joyce Vincent's life was not sudden. It was a slow, quiet erosion. In 2001, she resigned from her position at Ernst& Young. The reasons remain private, but it marked the end of her time in the corporate world. She spent time working briefly in other roles, but the stability was gone. Sometime around 2002, Joyce entered a domestic abuse shelter in Haringey. She was fleeing a relationship. This is a crucial detail. When a person enters a refugee, they are often advised to cut ties. To protect themselves, they must become invisible. They change their patterns. They stop calling old friends. They step back from the world to stay safe. Joyce followed this protocol. She began to distance herself from her family. She distanced herself from the friends she had known in the city. She was reconstructing her life, but in doing so, she was severing the lines of communication that kept her anchored. In February 2003, the Metropolitan Housing Trust found her a permanent place to live. It was the bedsit in Wood Green, a safe haven. She moved in. She was 38 years old. For the first few months, there were signs of life. She had some contact with her sisters, though it was sporadic. She was seen by neighbors. She was just another face in the block, another woman starting in the anonymity of London. But as 2003 progressed, the withdrawal deepened. November 2003. Joyce was hospitalized for 2 days at North Middlesex Hospital. She was treated for a peptic ulcer. She listed her next of kin as a bank manager. It was a sign of how far her personal network had receded. She was discharged and returned to the flat. December came. It was a cold winter. The residents of Wood Green turned up their radiators. They closed their windows against the chill. Inside the flat, Joyce was preparing for Christmas. She bought gifts. She wrapped them. We did not know who were there for, but the intent was there. She was planning to see people. She was planning to celebrate. At some point in the late December 2003, Joyce Carol Vincent locked the front door of her flat. She double locked it from the inside. She turned on the heating. She turned on the television and tuned it to BBC One. She sat down on the sofa. Whether it was a complication from a recent ulcer or an asthma attack, a condition she had suffered from for years, we will likely never know. She died there, on the sofa, surrounded by the presents she had wrapped. The television continued to play. The sun rose the next morning. The shoppers arrived at Wood Green. The traffic flowed, and the calendar began to turn. 2004 arrived. In the world outside, life was loud and urgent. In February 2004, Facebook was launched in the United States, changing how humans connected forever. Joyce sat in the blue light of the television. In August 2004, the Olympic Games were held in Athens. The cheers of the crowd were broadcast across the world. They likely played on the television set in Joyce's room, unwatched. The seasons changed. Winter turned to spring, spring to summer. The heating in the flat remained on. The windows were slightly open, allowing a draft to flow through the room. This airflow is significant. It accelerated the drying of the body. It prevented the immediate overwhelming signs of decay that usually alert neighbors within weeks. However, there were signs. Neighbors in the complex noticed a smell. In the heat of the summer of 2004, it became potent. But this is a housing complex above a shopping center. There are large commercial garbage bins directly below. The smell was attributed to the bins. It was dismissed as the cost of living in the city. Other neighbors noticed the noise. The television was always on, but in a block of flats with thin walls, noise is constant. You learn to tune it out. You assume that if the TV is on, the neighbor is home. If the neighbor is home, they want to be left alone. One neighbor later reported that they considered knocking on the door to complain about the noise, but they didn't. They didn't want a confrontation. The mail began to arrive and arrive and arrive. It slipped through the letterbox and landed on the floor. When the floor was full, it began to stack up against the door. Bank statements, utility bills, flyers for pizza delivery. How was the rent paid? This is the question everyone asks. Joyce was receiving benefits. The housing benefit was paid automatically, directly from the government to the Metropolitan Housing Trust. It covered half of the rent. As far as the landlord was concerned, money was coming in. The account was active. But Joyce was responsible for the other half, and that other half was not being paid. The arrears began to mount. 10 pounds became 100, 100 became 1,000. Automated letters were generated by computers and sent to the flat. They joined the pile on the floor. A full year had passed. Joyce was still on the sofa. In July 2005, London was shaken by the 7/11 bombings. The entire city came to a standstill. The mobile networks jammed as millions of people called their loved ones to check if they were safe. No one called the flat in Wood Green, or if they did, the phone simply rang in the darkness. Joyce's family had been looking for her. They had hired a private investigator. They had written letters to the address they thought she was at. But they didn't have the key. They assumed she had broken contact deliberately. They respected her silence, interpreting it as a desire for independence, not as a cry for help. The electricity continued to run. The bills were unpaid, but the utility companies did not cut the power. In the UK, it takes a long time to disconnect a residential property, especially during winter months, or if there is no response. The debt simply grew. The bugs came. Small insects found their way into the flat. They did what nature does. The ecosystem inside the room continued its grim work, utterly divorced from the civilization just inches away through the brick. By the end of 2005, the rent arrears had reached £2,400. The Housing Association's automated systems finally flagged the account for serious action. It was not a welfare check, it was a reposition order. January 25, 2006. Officials from the Metropolitan Housing Trust arrived at the property. They were there to evict the tenant. They knocked. Silence. They knocked again. Only the faint sound of the television from inside. They drilled the lock. The door was heavy to open. It was blocked by the mountain of mail, a paper drift 3 years deep. The housing officials stepped inside. The first thing that hit them was the heat. The heating had been running for 26 months. The air was dry, stifling. The second thing was the sound. BBC One was still broadcasting. The officials looked towards the living area. They saw the Christmas presents. They saw the sofa. And on the sofa, they saw the skeletal remains of Joyce Carol Vincent. She was lying on her back. She was still surrounded by the things she had gathered for Christmas that had passed 2 years ago. The police were called. The area was cordoned off. The discovery was so jarring, so impossible to comprehend, that initially it was treated as a potential crime scene. But the forensic evidence told a different story. The door was locked from inside. There was no damage to the frame. The windows were intact. There was no sign of a struggle. The body was so badly decomposed that visual identification was impossible. The woman, who had once been a face of corporate treasury department, was now unidentifiable. The police had to locate a photograph of Joyce smiling, a photograph from her better years, and compare the teeth in the picture to the remains of the sofa. It was a match. The pathologist, Dr. Simon Poole, conducted the post-mortem. He found no evidence of trauma. Because of the state of the body, he could not clinically prove the cause of death. He could not prove it was an asthma attack or the ulcer. He had to record an open verdict. Cause of death unascertained, skeletal remains. When the news broke, it did not stay local. It went national. It touched a nerve in the psyche of the country. People asked, how? How can a person be dead for 2 years in a city of 8 million people? How can a television play for thousands of hours without anyone investigating? How can a woman with 4 sisters and highly successful friends disappear? The Housing Trust issued statements. They reviewed their procedures. They said the automatic rent payments had masked the problem. The utility companies reviewed their policies on cutting power. But these were administrative answers to a human question. The neighbors were interviewed. They were ordinary people. They were not cruel. They were simply conditioned by the city. They respected privacy. They assumed that someone else was handling it. They assumed that the smell was the garbage. They assumed the noise was just the background static of urban life. The documentary filmmaker Carol Morley later investigated Joy's life for the film Dreams of a Life. She tracked down the people who knew Joyce. They were devastated. Martin Lister, a former partner, spoke of her with deep affection. He couldn't reconcile the vibrant, singing woman he knew with the image of the skeleton on the sofa. The tragedy of Joyce Vincent is not that she was unloved. It is that she fell through the cracks of a society designed to respect privacy above community. She had stepped away from the world to heal, but the world closed up behind her. Joyce was buried in a ceremony arranged by the local authority. Our family attended. They had to face the unimaginable guilt of not knowing, of sending letters that lay on a doormat while their sister lay dead just feet away. Our flat in Wood Green was cleared. The television was turned off. The heating was shut down. The mail was removed. The space was renovated and relet. Today, someone else lives in that flat. They walk on the same floors. They look out of the same windows at the shoppers in Wood Green. They hear the same traffic. We like to think we are connected. We have phones in our pockets. We have social media. We are constantly in touch. But the story of Joyce Vincent asks a quieter, more uncomfortable question. If we fell silent today, how long would it take for the world to knock on your door? Drop in comments.